Okay, so let's start with an example from outside math in which more or less a clear definition is agreed upon. Again, when I say that, I don't mean like every single person on the planet agrees, but the vast majority agrees to such an extent that there is a clear understanding of the concept, at least at the legal level. I'm going to talk about essentially a crime, or two types of crimes. So there is such. So there are two different types of crimes that can result in the death of a victim. So one of them is, let's label this by M, which is manslaughter, and the PM, which is premeditated murder. So I'm not going to go into the legal details and what constitutes each of them, except that, just to remind in case something is misleading about it. So essentially manslaughter means any crime that results in the loss of death but without intent, like an accident. So in fact, I'm going to talk about accidents in this case, primarily. Although again, it's a very short descriptive term. And the self term is, of course, is self-explanatory, right? I mean, when the intent is to actually kill the victim. So the clear definition that I'm going to talk about here, so this is what would be an example of a clear definition, is that for the most part, to the point of course, this being codified in the legal, in the penal code, is that if you make a graph of, let's say, the type of crime versus the severity of the crime, most people do agree that the manslaughter sits somewhere here, in the severity, and the premeditated murder somewhere here. Okay, so if you imagine a continuum of various crimes, there is obvious a difference between how serious a crime is versus the other. So we have two distinct examples of crimes that lead to the loss of life. However, the vast majority of people understand that this is far more serious, and of course, the punishment is more serious. Why this is useful? Because notice this doesn't actually eliminate the debate. For example, if your loved one is a victim of a drunk driving accident, you could argue, for example, that if someone decides to drive while drunk behind the wheels, then you already have an intent of your consequences. And, consequences can be, of course, loss of innocent life if you do that. That's a little bit of a stretch, but it's a room for a debate. Notice that this is essentially still agreeing on the fact that this is more serious than this. The question is, how do you prove intent, essentially, and whether actually the neglect is an intent if you know very well that your neglect can result in the loss of life. So, but imagine, for example, if the situation is not clear and we wouldn't have this distinction, then of course the debate will be very impossible to solve pretty much on any issues, because then you could argue unreasonable punishments for clearly unintentional accidents that can happen to anybody, and so on and so forth. So again, whether we like it or not, a clear definition agreed upon helps quite a lot in situations like this. And that's why we have, of course, to the best of the abilities, clear definitions, because it's not always as clear as we want, of various items in the penal code. On the flip side, and again, I don't want you to think that I'm trying to actually argue for one point or the other, but this is a very easy example to have in mind, because it's debated and discussed quite a lot of times in the media, is, for instance, debates related to the abortion issue, or the abortion debate. So, in my opinion, the lack of a proper definition of the fundamental concepts is what makes these debates to be pretty much, many of them at least, a waste of time, because they start, just like Joe and Bill beforehand, with perfectly valid arguments, but with a common definition missing in those arguments. So we know that we have essentially two different positions, the so-called the pro-life definition, the pro-choice, and then the debate is endless, and of course very important, because that issues like this, of course, dictate, how people elect politicians, what they care about when they actually look, at policies or decisions by judges and so on and so forth. So I'm not going to get into that. I just want to focus on the fact that the problem with debates like this is the lack of a common definition of the concept. So the debate starts essentially by arguing whether there should be legal to remove something from a woman's body, right? So that lack of definition starts from understanding essentially what that is, right? So do we, for example, terminate life or not? And of course, even more fundamental than that, what life is. And we should have full sympathy with both sides of the debates in this case, because this is not at all an easy concept. In fact, if you are curious to go on Wikipedia and look at the article for life, there is a section on definition, and you read the first 2 lines and you realize how difficult it is actually to define the concept. If I remember correctly, it says something like, definition of life is difficult because it's a process, not a substance. So that basically encapsulates quite a lot of the difficulty about the issue. Most of the debates start on this topic with not a common agreement on what they're talking about. Some debates, of course, are a little bit closer to a common ground. For example, they could, say, okay, let's forget about the biological definition of life, but let's talk about the legal definition of life, in the sense that, what does this country agrees upon on what constitutes a living being, and then you have a cutoff point or whatever, and then you can start from there. But most of the debates in my experience on this topic actually start from personal feelings and definitions about the concept that are completely different with the debater. And in my opinion, any debate, not only on these issues, and again, regardless of your position on any of these hard topics, it's going to be a waste of time if it's not strictly limited to an object where the definition is common for the two that they talk about. So before I even, for example, state a position that I have on an issue, I got to figure out what the definition of this word is. And that's basically, a full-time job on its own. Now, we can start a debate, for example, with something a little bit lesser than just defining life. Like, for example, is it okay to establish, for example, a certain limitation of a certain right or not? Okay, like this one. And then you can focus just on that without getting into, large concepts of what life is. Although, again, sometimes it's unavoidable. So in my opinion, that's why these concepts are very difficult to for a resolution in discussions among people with different views, because again, they don't spend enough time with defining the concept. And I'm going to go back to mathematics in a later video with some other interesting examples from probabilities, for instance, in which, again, there is a misunderstanding on a result. And if you look deeply, it's, again, a matter of not using either a proper or, again, at least a common definition or agreed upon definition. And, again, this is a hard topic, of course, but there are plenty of other examples in which, common definition leads to endless debates. One of them, for example, is trade-offs between electing politicians. In which case, for example, if you really believe that, let's say, a certain candidate is, let's say, a mortal danger, for the planet, then of course the means of stopping that person are completely different in your mind in terms of whether they're valid or not, than if that person, let's say, is a regular person who doesn't pose that much of a threat. But again, the definition is missing here, because when you debate with someone who has a different opinion, you have to agree upon with the premise. Do we talk about a regular person? Do we talk about devil incarnated? And so on and so forth. Because again, if there is a disagreement on the main definition of the object debate, then of course it's a waste of time, since each side has valid arguments for the definition they have in their mind. So I hope this is useful, and it's a little bit of a departure from math, but I hope it's clear it's not that much of a departure if you think about it. Math, of course, is a little bit easier than life, because Mathematical statements are very limited. You see, I mean, it's one thing to talk about life issues, and something else to talk about how we define, an infinite sum. It's just a very small item. We define it, and we live ever happily ever after that, with that definition. So that's it for today. I'll see you soon.